Welcome to Charts Today. It is Wednesday, the 20th of May, and we start by looking at the pound against the US dollar. We've had inflation numbers out in the UK this morning that were better than expected, fall of about 0.5%, which most commentators believe will be short-lived with everything that's going on in the world. But the interesting thing is that that's probably going to delay a decision from the Bank of England next month. So we are seeing that sterling is just a little bit weaker on that. We're waiting to see. There is a potential. This is the 60-minute chart. So that selling thrust has produced this downside target where sterling will fall further, but we need to break below 133 to activate that downside target back into the 120s. It's hard to imagine sterling lower, but I think more and more the Bank of England is between a rock and a hard place in terms of worrying about growth and fighting inflation. So the market is starting to discount the idea maybe that they will raise rates next month. And so if we look at the long-term position, this is the medium term. If we look at the long-term chart, the expectation longer term is that we will see a rate rise and waiting to see an upside target. So the interesting thing is just looking at those time horizons suggests we fall before we rise. And so that's quite interesting. Of course, that's the dollar sterling rate, and a lot will depend on the dollar. This is the long-term picture on the dollar, and that is still quite bearish. And if we look at the short term, we are seeing the dollar index actually breaking higher. So that's interesting that the dollar is gaining some strength right now. But that medium-term chart is the daily chart. We are in a range. So long-term bearish, medium-term in a range, neutral, and short-term bullish. And so that's how we just resolve the trends. So looking at Bitcoin, I get asked about Bitcoin quite a lot. That is just neutral really, because we're pulling back. And are we going to make a higher low and then high and then a new low? So looking at the 60-minute chart, that looks like that move might be coming to an end. We're finding some support around 76,000. If you're trading Bitcoin, you want to be looking at the shorter term targets. So looking at Treasury yields, we start by just looking at what's going on in the bond markets. This is still a major concern for financial markets. And if we look at Japan, still sitting on around that 280 level, has pulled back today to 276. But this is a major worry. And looking at US yields, again, we're seeing levels not seen for quite some time, sitting at around 4.7% on the 10-year yield, but a target at 4.9 is still there in place. And if you go to the longer term charts, you can see the risk is the move, the consolidation, break to new high, and then those upside targets start to play in. It's the uncertainty, but it really does favor the upside out of that consolidation. So looking at the UK, we're seeing gilts and the 10-year down a bit this morning. When we look at the 60-minute chart, you can see we've got a little downside target there. But the picture is still one of rising yields over the long term. So looking at stock markets, we've got the S&P future up slightly, but markets have topped a bit there. If we look at the Nasdaq, we talked about this weekly candle last week. If we look at the chart, got a little bit of a doji there, quite hard to see. And so we are on a down week in the Nasdaq. That could be a little bit of a longer term top. And we're seeing that there. And we go to the 60-minute chart. We have got a downside target. We're not quite through the cloud yet, but we can see that the upside target not quite met. Remember, that is a bearish confirmation. And now we've got a downside target, and that's down still another 3% potentially. Looking at the other markets, Dow Jones, the future on the Dow, we've failed to make a new high. So that's a bit of a struggle. That just shows the bellwethers, the top 30 in the US, not making new highs. And we are seeing indices down in Europe this morning. We've got the Nasdaq, the DAX down 0.5%. The UK market down 0.4%. We'll look at some stocks in a minute. Japan hit again, down 1.6%. And of course, their currency, that we talked about intervention on the yen, as we climb towards that 160 level, expect to see intervention again from the Bank of Japan. But all in all, and then we saw the Aussie market further hit. And that is really starting to look quite weak below the cloud, waiting to see if we activate a downside target. Looking at the 60-minute chart, we have got downside targets on the short term. So it is a bad week for the Aussie market for sure. The Sensex continues in India, continues to look very weak indeed below the cloud. Again, we could go to the short-term targets there, and we can see we've got downside targets for the Sensex as well. So stocks really being hit. And of course, the Indian economy, with things like the Indian Rupee, this has been a really big worry, climbing to new highs all the time there. That's going to be very inflationary for the Indian economy. So coming back to stocks, they're looking a bit weaker. We are seeing some precious metals. This is the gold chart, has activated that downside target on the daily and 60-minute. We've got downside targets. We have got silver up nearly 2% this morning. Not enough to really change the picture. That's the short-term picture. And then if we look at the daily chart, we can see we have got downside targets and we are below the cloud. The long-term picture is one where we have to wait to see, do we break to new lows? So medium and short-term is not looking great at the moment. Looking at some of the soft commodities, they've really, we've seen some really big moves here. We talked about coffee yesterday. This is the September contract. Looking at the July contract, breaking lower as well, and that longer dated September contract breaking lower. That's a big move down for coffee. Sugar, we are seeing a little bit of an improvement. This is the daily chart. We are going potentially into a range. I talked about that yesterday. We have seen commodities like wheat and corn really just pushing higher. So that's quite key. Even oats. All these soft commodities. It's interesting, we've had the UK inflation number out, but we have got big moves, and the producer prices that will filter into inflation, we are seeing big moves there. And things like, just looking at some of the soft things like canola, soybeans, upside targets there. Urea, this has fallen back. This is a daily quote, which is why it's a line chart. This is very heavily driven by the Middle East crisis, and this has fallen back, but it is still inflated. The Dow Jones Index, we had quite a lot of movement yesterday in the Dow. The better looking stocks, only a handful up. Merck looking a little bit better. Walmart continuing to look very strong, just nudging new highs there. So that's quite key. You can go to the 60-minute chart for a heads up. You're going to get the shorter term targets. And then if we look at the UK market, we can see this morning, if we just rank by percentage, we've got stocks like Severn Trent going into a bit of a consolidation phase. M&S, quite interesting seeing them there. They're not looking great in terms of the trends and targets. Glencore continuing to look pretty strong there. Rio, another one that has been breaking to new highs. Ones that are being hit, EasyJet, obviously. I've just booked some flights myself this morning to see a client in Germany next month. We're seeing here breaking to new lows. And IAG, which is basically British Airways, also holding up a little bit better than EasyJet, but still not looking great. So it's a very, very mixed picture. You've got to find those stocks where you've got good trends and good upside targets. That's it for today. Until tomorrow, have a great day. Bye for now.